The sea wind swept across the harbor, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and diesel, an aroma that always pulled Lucky Luciano back into the memories he tried his whole life to outrun. In his final years, standing on the edge of Naples, he looked less like the feared architect of modern organized crime and more like a man haunted by the choices that had defined him. Yet behind those aging eyes, the sharpness hadn't faded. His mind, once the most dangerous weapon in America's underworld, remained restless, calculating, always searching for patterns, opportunities, threats. It was that mind, not his fists or his reputation, that transformed him from a poor immigrant kid into a criminal kingmaker. But to understand the intelligence that built an empire, you have to slow down the myth and look at the man. Lucky Luciano didn't rise by accident. His success wasn't about luck, violence, or even charisma, though he had all three. His dominance came from a deeper instinct, something raw and almost surgical, the ability to read people, to sense tension before it erupted, to predict outcomes before anyone else could even see their shape. He was a strategist in a world full of reactionaries. While others fought for scraps on the street, Luciano studied the entire board. In this opening moment of his life's reflection, the contradictions of his existence become painfully clear. This was a man who believed in power yet understood its fragility. A man who manipulated loyalty but never fully trusted anyone. A man who built a criminal government more organized than many legitimate ones, yet ended his life far from the country whose underworld he re-engineered. Alone, exiled, and watched by police even in death, he carried an invisible crown forged from influence rather than ceremony. The story of Lucky Luciano's criminal intelligence begins long before his public rise. It begins with an inner hunger, an almost desperate need to never be powerless again. Growing up in the brutal slums of Manhattan, surrounded by gangs that controlled everything from the alleys to the street corners, he learned that survival required more than toughness. It required calculation. Every choice, every alliance, every risk had to be weighed. Even as a child, he wasn't impulsive. He watched people. He noticed weaknesses. He figured out who feared what, who owed who, and how money altered behavior. This was not education from books or classrooms. It was education earned in dirty hallways, backrooms, and street corners. Years later, as the waves hit the stone edges of Naples, he revisited these lessons in silence. His life had been built on a single truth. Power belongs to the one who understands human nature better than anyone else. Luciano understood greed, fear, ambition, envy, and desire with an almost clinical precision. He realized early that if you controlled what people wanted or feared, you controlled the people themselves. That insight would become the backbone of everything he built: the commission, the five families, the national rackets. And it all began because he recognized something obvious that others ignored. Criminals were wasting fortunes by fighting instead of organizing. But even a mind like his didn't evolve in a straight line. Luciano's intelligence was shaped by pain, betrayal, and near-death moments that forced him to adapt. Every scar was a lesson, every setback a recalibration. He never tried to fight the world head-on. He tried to understand its rhythms and then bend them. That was his genius. Others enforced rules. Luciano created systems. Others sought territory. He sought influence. Others wanted to be feared. He wanted to be indispensable. As he stood by the water in his later years, memories of the rise and fall flickered through him like passing ghosts. He thought about the people he had lifted and the people he had buried. He thought about the balance between loyalty and manipulation, about the cost of building something too powerful to control. His empire had been designed to outlast him, but even the strongest empires had cracks. He knew that better than anyone. Still, there was a strange calm in him, something almost reflective, as if he understood that legacy is not decided by the man himself but by the stories told afterward. And the story of Lucky Luciano is not simply about crime. It is about intellect sharpened by adversity. It is about a mind that saw opportunity in chaos. It is about a man who studied every weakness, his own included, and used that knowledge to build a criminal civilization unlike anything before or since. This documentary begins here, on this quiet shoreline, because it is the best place to examine his mind without the noise of legend or sensationalism. In his old age, stripped of the power he once commanded, Luciano becomes fully visible. The clarity of his thoughts, the weight of his regrets, the pride he still carried. These pieces reveal the architecture of the intelligence that changed America's underworld forever. Before we dive into the violence, the alliances, the betrayals, and the empire, it's important to sit with the man in this solitary moment. To feel the contradictions inside him. To understand the psychology behind the decisions that shaped a nation's criminal history. Because once you understand what drove him, what terrified him, what inspired him, you begin to see that Lucky Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was a strategist who viewed crime not as chaos but as a business. A leader who understood people more deeply than any professor or politician. A man whose greatest weapon was not a gun, but his mind. And it is inside that mind, its brilliance, its darkness, its discipline, its instinct, that the real story begins. Before Lucky Luciano ever stepped into the spotlight of American crime, the world he was born into was already a tinderbox, chaotic, disorganized, and primed for transformation. Early 20th century America was not the land of opportunity it claimed to be for millions of immigrants. It was a fractured society where the streets were ruled not by law, but by whoever had the muscle, the numbers, or the willingness to bleed. Crime existed in raw, shapeless forms. Neighborhood gangs, ethnic cliques, and loosely connected criminal crews that fought constantly over scraps. Violence was unpredictable, alliances were unstable, and every territory line was drawn in blood. The underworld was less a system and more a battleground where young men survived by instinct alone. The Lower East Side, where Luciano grew up, was a perfect reflection of this disorder. Tens of thousands of immigrants, Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, were packed into tight, unforgiving blocks. Poverty wasn't just an economic condition, it was an atmosphere, a constant pressure that shaped every decision. In these neighborhoods, children were introduced to crime as casually as others might be introduced to school. Small gangsters roamed the streets collecting protection money. Street fights were common. Disputes were settled with knives, not negotiations. In this environment, criminality wasn't a choice, it was a language everyone was forced to understand just to survive. Before Luciano, the Italian underworld in America was dominated by an old-world mindset. Sicilian bosses clung to traditions imported from villages and mountain towns, deeply rooted in family hierarchy, rigid rules, and an obsession with old feuds. Rival groups like the Morello family, the Neapolitan Camorra, and other regional factions refused to cooperate, each believing their old country customs gave them superior claim. The result was constant infighting, wasted opportunities, and a criminal scene that was always on the edge of implosion. No one trusted anyone. No one imagined a united organization. Violence was reactionary and business was secondary. Then came Prohibition in 1920, an event that turned small-time criminals into potential millionaires overnight. Suddenly there was more money in illegal alcohol than any previous racket. But the explosion of profit also magnified the chaos. Every crew wanted a piece of the action. Murders skyrocketed. Bootleg liquor territories became battlegrounds. What should have been a golden age of criminal profits was instead a period of reckless bloodshed because the underworld lacked structure. No shared vision. No leadership that could unify competing interests. No system to control greed or regulate disputes. It was like a marketplace without rules, everyone fighting, everyone losing something. Police corruption added a new layer of unpredictability. Bribes flowed freely, but loyalty from officers could never be guaranteed. A cop paid off one month might be replaced or bought by a rival the next. Even corrupt politicians were overwhelmed by the sheer number of gangs operating across New York City. There were too many hands in too many pockets, and no one had the authority to stabilize anything. Criminal opportunity had never been greater, yet the infrastructure to harness it did not exist. Within the underworld itself, power shifted constantly. You could be a leader one week and a corpse the next. Old bosses like Giuseppe Morello ran their operations with suspicion and paranoia, which only fueled more betrayals. Every ethnic group had its own gangs, each with different customs and grudges. Italians often refused to work with Jews. Sicilians clashed with Neapolitans. The Irish ran their own neighborhoods with fists and shotguns. A criminal economy capable of producing millions was splintered into 1,000 pieces simply because no one could imagine unity. This was the world Lucky Luciano studied from the sidelines as a young man. A world defined by wasted potential. A world where violence was constant, but profit was inconsistent. A world where an intelligent, forward-thinking leader could reshape everything, but no such leader existed yet. Crime in America was stuck in an old-world mentality while the country itself was modernizing at lightning speed. Skyscrapers rose, Wall Street boomed, and new technologies reshaped society, yet the underworld clung to medieval loyalties and superstitions. Luciano watched it all carefully. He saw how much money was being lost to pointless conflict. He saw how stubborn the old bosses were, how afraid they were to change, and how blind they were to the potential around them. He realized that the power available in America was far greater than what any Sicilian village crime family had ever managed. This was a country built for enterprise, even illegal enterprise, if only someone had the vision to organize it properly. Before his rise, America's criminal world was a puzzle with mismatched pieces, violent, fragmented, and tragically inefficient. It was a place where intelligence was rare and long-term planning was almost non-existent. This landscape of disorder became Luciano's greatest opportunity. The chaos of the era didn't intimidate him, it inspired him. Where others saw threats, he saw untapped potential. Where others feared broken alliances, he imagined a structure where alliances could be regulated. Where the old guard clung to pride and tradition, Luciano envisioned something far bigger, a national criminal network run like a corporation. Understanding the world before Luciano is essential, because it shows the magnitude of the transformation he brought. He didn't just rise within an existing system. He replaced it entirely. He took gangs that had spent decades killing each other over small territories and forced them into an organized, profitable partnership. He turned street criminals into businessmen. And he imposed order on a world built on chaos. The America he inherited was wild and divided. The America he reshaped became the cradle of the modern mafia. This is the landscape that sets the stage for his rise. A world begging for leadership, for vision, for someone who could see beyond the next knife fight or bootlegging score. Before Lucky Luciano, crime in America was a storm with no center. After him, it would become a structured empire. And that difference, between chaos and order, defines why his mind, more than his muscle, became the foundation of an entire criminal era. The story of Lucky Luciano truly begins long before he became a legend. Back when he was just Salvatore Lucania, a small, wiry boy from the dusty Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti. Life there was defined by hunger, superstition, and struggle. The air was filled with the sound of miners hacking away underground and families scraping by with barely enough bread to last a day. Crime wasn't an aberration in Sicily, it was woven into survival. Even as a child, Luciano absorbed the unspoken rules of power. Respect was currency, reputation was armor, and fear was a language. His family, desperate for a better life, joined the tidal wave of immigrants crossing the Atlantic. When Luciano stepped onto American soil at 10 years old, the promise of opportunity dissolved almost instantly. New York City's Lower East Side wasn't a dreamland, it was a battlefield of poverty. Filthy tenement buildings leaned into each other like exhausted fighters. Sewage ran in the streets. Children slept 3 to a bed. Rats were so common they blended into the scenery. For a young boy with no English, no money, and no connections, this wasn't a new beginning, it was a different kind of struggle. But something in Luciano sparked in these conditions. He observed everything, the way older boys formed alliances, how street merchants paid protection because they feared the consequences, how the presence of a single tough kid could change the energy of an entire block. While other children were overwhelmed by the chaos, Luciano was studying it. The Lower East Side became his first classroom, and power dynamics became his earliest lessons. School offered him no escape. He hated the structure, the language barrier, the humiliation of poverty. He had no patience for lectures about American ideals when he could barely afford shoes. So he drifted to the streets, where he found something far more interesting: influence. By the age of 14 he wasn't just surviving, he was building. In small ways at first. He charged neighborhood kids 10 cents for protection from beatings. If they refused, he arranged for them to be beaten and then offered the same protection again. To him this wasn't cruelty. It was business logic. It was supply and demand. Even at that age he understood leverage. His early friendships shaped his evolution. Meeting Meyer Lansky was a turning point, where Luciano gained not just an ally but a mirror. Lansky wasn't big or intimidating, but he was intelligent, calm, and strategic. Luciano recognized in him a rare mind, sharp and disciplined. Their childhood respect would become the backbone of an empire decades later. Bugsy Siegel, on the other hand, was pure volatility, a fearless, impulsive force of nature. Luciano admired Siegel's audacity the same way he admired Lansky's brains. From these two he learned that power required balance. Calculation from some, aggression from others. The more he watched the world around him, the more Luciano realized the rules of America were different from Sicily, yet built on the same foundation. Everything revolved around who controlled who. The Irish gangs ruled some blocks, the Italian gangs others, and violence was always just one insult away. But unlike the old men who clung to Sicilian traditions, Luciano saw possibility in the diversity of these neighborhoods. He worked with Jews, Italians, and Irish kids, something older crime figures refused to do. It wasn't idealism. It was instinct. He recognized talent in people, not ethnicity. By his mid-teens, Luciano was running errands for local gangsters, learning the mechanics of the street, how money was collected, how stolen goods were moved, how disputes were settled when fists failed. Each job taught him something new. He didn't just execute orders, he absorbed strategy. Why did this man fear that boss? Why did this neighborhood produce more revenue than another? Why did one gang thrive while another fell apart? His mind was always connecting dots, building a sense of structure in a world that seemed inherently disordered. As he got older, he developed another skill, charisma. He wasn't movie star handsome, but he carried himself with a confidence far beyond his years. He spoke directly. He listened closely. People noticed him. He had the unusual ability to make others feel respected, even valued, while still maintaining dominance. This was a psychological edge that most street kids never developed. It allowed him to move between groups, earn trust, and gather information that would later prove vital. Yet beneath the charm and street smarts, Luciano had something even more important: ambition. A deep, burning desire to escape the suffocating limitations of poverty. He didn't want to be just another street hustler. He wanted control, wealth, and freedom, things he had seen only from a distance. That ambition made him bold enough to take risks others avoided. When he gambled big. When he stepped into trouble, he stepped in with full confidence. Failure never intimidated him. In his world, those who hesitated were crushed. But ambition without guidance can be dangerous, and Luciano's early life was filled with rough lessons. Arrests, fights, betrayals, each one chipped away at his innocence and sharpened his awareness. Every mistake was a recalibration. He learned when to speak and, more importantly, when to stay silent. He learned that loyalty could be bought, but trust had a price. He learned that violence was necessary but only effective when used sparingly and with purpose. These were not the lessons of childhood, they were the lessons of survival. And through it all, the underworld kept evolving around him. Gangs grew more sophisticated. Prohibition loomed on the horizon. New York was becoming a magnet for opportunity, both legal and illegal. Luciano could feel the shift before most. Something inside him understood that the old-style neighborhood gangs were too small, too localized, too primitive. America was too big for the old rules. The future belonged to someone who could think beyond the next street corner, someone who could break free from ethnic barriers and ancient grudges. That realization, forming quietly in the mind of a teenage immigrant, would eventually change the entire criminal landscape of the United States. The rise of Lucky Luciano didn't begin with a dramatic event. It began with observation, hunger, and an instinctive ability to read the world around him. Long before he became the mastermind behind the modern mafia, he was a boy watching, analyzing, and learning, preparing himself for a future he could already sense but not yet define. Every street fight, every friendship, every lesson in the dark corners of the Lower East Side slowly sculpted him into the man he would become. This is where the seeds of his intelligence were planted, not in books or schools, but in the harsh, unforgiving reality of immigrant life. And as he climbed through these early years, one truth became clear. Luciano wasn't just surviving poverty, he was studying it, mastering it, using it as the foundation upon which he would build an empire. Luciano's teenage years marked the true beginning of his evolution from a clever street kid into a calculating criminal strategist. These were the years when instinct sharpened into intelligence, when every fight, every betrayal, every backroom deal became a lesson that would later shape the Mafia's golden age. The Lower East Side was unforgiving, but for Luciano, it was the perfect training ground, a place where only those with a sharp eye and a fast mind could climb above the rest. He wasn't yet the kingpin the world would learn to fear, but the foundations of that future were being carved into him with every step he took through the city's alleys and illicit meeting spots. As he grew older, his work became more serious. What had begun as petty hustles evolved into real criminal responsibilities. He handled small-time protection rackets, moved stolen goods, and helped run errands for higher-level gangsters. He became known as someone who could be trusted to get things done, not recklessly but efficiently. Even then, Luciano displayed a rare trait. He didn't need to be the loudest man in the room. He didn't posture. He didn't bluff. He preferred silence, observation, and precision. These early habits made him stand out in a world where most young criminals equated respect with noise. One of the defining characteristics of Luciano's early criminal intelligence was his ability to analyze risk. He had the uncanny ability to assess the consequences of a decision before taking it. Where others were fueled by temper or impulse, Luciano was guided by a kind of internal blueprint, an understanding that success in the underworld depended more on planning than intimidation. He knew when to walk away, when to strike, and when to appear indifferent. These instincts made him valuable not just as a muscle but as a thinker. During these formative years, Luciano also developed a profound understanding of people. He quickly learned that fear alone was an unstable form of control. A man terrified of you today might turn on you tomorrow if he sensed an opportunity. But a man who respected you, even grudgingly, would remain more predictable. So Luciano built his influence through a balance of respect and fear, always leaning toward whichever was more effective in the moment. His early protection schemes perfectly demonstrated this balance. He'd offer help to kids being bullied. If they accepted, they gained a protector. If they refused, he'd let the bullies rough them up and then approach them again. The message was clear. He controlled both the threat and the solution. But Luciano didn't want to remain a small-time operator. He watched the higher-ranking Italian gangsters, noting everything, from how they collected debts to how they settled disputes. The older gang members noticed him not because he was the strongest, but because he was reliable and intelligent. He understood that criminal success required structure, discipline, and the ability to recognize opportunity. When Prohibition approached, he sensed change before most of the old guard did. The future, he realized, wouldn't belong to the traditional Sicilian bosses clinging to outdated rules. It would belong to those who could adapt. One of the most pivotal shifts in his early years came from the alliances he formed. Luciano refused to confine himself to one ethnic group. While other Italians distrusted outsiders, he sought them out. His bond with Meyer Lansky deepened into a partnership built on mutual respect. Lansky's calm, mathematical mind complemented Luciano's intuitive grasp of human psychology. Together they earned money, avoided unnecessary fights, and planned moves with a strategic mindset far beyond their age. Where other street kids saw a quick score, they saw stepping stones. Bugsy Siegel added another dimension to their circle: fearlessness. Siegel was explosive and dangerous, willing to do what others feared. Luciano understood the value of controlled violence, and Siegel became the force he could unleash when necessary. The trio represented something new, a multi-ethnic union that ignored the traditions of their elders. Most Italian bosses were horrified at the idea of working closely with Jews or Irish gangsters. Luciano embraced it because he saw potential. These early alliances not only made him money, they expanded his worldview, making him see the underworld as a network rather than isolated neighborhoods. Luciano also learned the unspoken rules of survival. He understood that reputation mattered more than truth. A single rumor could destroy a man's standing. A single act of weakness could invite attack. So he crafted his public image carefully. He dressed better than most kids his age, spoke confidently, and carried himself with a poised calmness. People noticed. They respected him. Even older men began coming to him for advice on disputes. He was still young, but his aura was growing. Yet his rise was not without obstacles. Arrests came early and often, each one a test of his nerve. He learned how to talk to police without giving them anything useful, how to maintain composure under pressure, how to avoid getting rattled even when he faced jail time. These encounters hardened him and taught him how law enforcement operated, their blind spots, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He stored this knowledge away, knowing it would serve him in the future. Another profound lesson came from violence, not just using it but understanding its psychology. Luciano realized that brutality was most effective when it was predictable. Wild violence scared people temporarily, controlled violence scared them permanently. He watched how some gangsters used violence to send messages, while others used it impulsively and destroyed their own empires. Luciano chose the strategic path. He learned when to carry out a beating, when to step back, and when to let rumors do the work for him. He once said later in life that the goal wasn't to kill a man but to make the next 10 men think twice before crossing you. But perhaps the most important skill he developed during these years was patience. He didn't rush his rise. He took jobs beneath him to earn trust. He watched older bosses fail because they let ego drive their decisions. He understood that a crime empire couldn't be built simply by force. It required timing, diplomacy, and information. And he collected information relentlessly. He knew which gang was weak, which business owner could be squeezed, which cop could be bought, which rival was on the verge of collapse. Intelligence gathering became his invisible weapon. These early years shaped Luciano into something rare, a criminal who could think long-term. While most young gangsters thought only of the next score, Luciano thought of the next year, the next power shift, the next opportunity to climb beyond the limitations of his immigrant upbringing. He recognized that the New York underworld was a machine full of broken parts, and he began forming the blueprint of how to fix it. By the time he reached adulthood, Luciano was no longer just a street hustler. He was a rising figure, sharp, disciplined, connected, and increasingly respected. The lessons he learned during these formative years would later become the foundation of the system he built, a system that transformed the mafia from a chaotic cluster of street gangs into a national organization structured like a corporation. Everything he would one day become, the kingmaker, the reformer, the mastermind, was already visible in these early transformations. The Lower East Side didn't just shape him, it sculpted the intelligence that would eventually reshape American crime forever. The night of the attack began like any other for Luciano, another evening moving through the shadowed corridors of New York's underworld, another night spent balancing alliances and ambitions. But what happened next would become the most defining trauma of his life. In April 1929, Luciano was kidnapped by unknown assailants, beaten nearly to death, stabbed repeatedly, and left unconscious on Staten Island's shore with his throat slashed. Whoever targeted him wanted to send a message, either to him, to his allies, or to the entire criminal world. For Luciano, this wasn't just an assault, it was a brutal awakening, a moment that burned itself into his psyche and permanently altered the way he viewed power, loyalty, and survival. When he regained consciousness in the hospital, his face swollen beyond recognition and his body marked with new scars, he claimed he didn't know who attacked him. That was the public story. Privately, however, he understood the deeper truth. Someone had seen him as a threat. He had grown too powerful, too respected, too independent. The old bosses who clung to tradition despised his alliances with Jewish and Irish criminals. The younger radicals wanted his influence. Rivals feared he was becoming the future of the underworld. That night, someone acted on that fear. The physical pain was overwhelming, but the psychological impact carved even deeper. Lying in that hospital bed, Luciano reflected on the fragile nature of power. He had always understood violence as a possibility, but now it became personal in a way he had never anticipated. He realized that survival in the world he occupied wasn't about brute courage or loyalty, it was about adaptability, strategic detachment, and control. This attack forced him to confront his own vulnerabilities. It made him understand that even the smartest, most connected man could be caught off guard if he didn't think further ahead than everyone else. Before the beating, Luciano had been bold, even reckless at times. He took risks freely, confident that his reputation and alliances would protect him. After the beating, something hardened inside him. The scars on his face became a permanent reminder of the price of complacency. He learned that power wasn't something you earned once, it was something you protected constantly. He learned that trust, even in allies, had limits. And most importantly, he learned that a true leader had to control every variable, including the unpredictability of those who resented him. This near-death moment became a psychological turning point, shaping his transformation from a rising street boss into a mastermind of organization and long-term strategy. He began distancing himself from the petty disputes and impulsive decisions that consumed other young gangsters. Instead, he started thinking on a larger scale. Who controlled which neighborhoods? Who wanted war? Who wanted profit? Who was unreliable? Who could be molded into an ally? The attack forced him to confront the truth that survival would require not just strength but foresight. It also clarified something he had sensed for years but never fully embraced. The old mafia ways were dying. The rigid, Sicilian-style hierarchy was crumbling under the weight of paranoia and outdated customs. Old bosses clung to honor codes that had no place in the rapidly evolving American underworld. The future wouldn't belong to men who worshipped ancient traditions, it would belong to men who could build a new system. The attack made Luciano more disciplined in choosing whom to trust. He cut ties with unstable associates, strengthened his bonds with strategic partners like Lansky, and paid closer attention to the patterns of betrayal around him. He became more secretive, more deliberate, and more calculating. He stopped revealing his long-term plans and began controlling information the way a chess master controls the board, carefully, selectively, and always with an endgame in mind. The beating also shaped his understanding of fear as a tool. He realized that fear could either destroy a man or refine him. For some, trauma becomes a prison. For Luciano, it became a forge. The attempt on his life made him more dangerous, not because it filled him with rage but because it stripped him of illusions. He didn't become paranoid, he became aware. He didn't become vengeful, he became strategic. The attack didn't break him, it sharpened him. He began studying the weaknesses of the criminal world around him. The ethnic divisions that caused chaos. The personal grudges that sparked unnecessary killings. The lack of structure that turned profitable businesses into violent free-for-alls. He realized that the underworld needed order, rules, regulation, unity. And he understood that the only way to achieve that was to dismantle the old system and build a new one in its place. The scars he carried after the beating became symbolic. They served as a constant reminder of the reality of power. It could be taken from you in an instant if you weren't prepared to defend it. But beyond that, the scars represented a rebirth. The Luciano who emerged from the hospital was not the same man who entered it. The new Luciano was colder, more focused, more aware of the stakes. He no longer wanted to be just another boss. He wanted to be the architect of something bigger. The beating is often romanticized in popular stories, but its true impact lies not in the violence itself, but in the psychological shift it created. It was the moment that forced Luciano to refine his instincts, strengthen his resolve, and commit fully to his vision of a unified criminal empire. It is no exaggeration to say that modern organized crime in America was born the day Luciano opened his swollen eyes in that hospital bed and realized the world he wanted to build would require him to outthink every enemy he had, including the ones who might stand beside him. From that point on, Luciano operated as a man who understood the cost of ambition, the danger of envy, and the necessity of absolute control. And it was this transformation, triggered by the beating that nearly killed him, that propelled him into becoming the mind behind a new era of organized crime, the era that would carry his name into history. What emerged in the aftermath of the Castellamarese War was not just a victory, it was a revolution. Luciano stood before a shattered underworld, one filled with exhausted gunmen, paranoid bosses, and criminal networks running on outdated customs. For decades, the American Mafia had acted like a patchwork of feuding tribes, each consumed by ego and old country grudges. Luciano saw something no one else did. They weren't just fighting over power, they were fighting over a broken system. And if he didn't rebuild it, the entire underworld would collapse into endless cycles of bloodshed. This realization sparked the single most important transformation of his life: the creation of organized crime 2.0, a system based not on tradition but on logic, structure, and business intelligence. To understand the scale of what he built, you must first understand what he dismantled. The old mafia hierarchy was suffocating, built around unquestioned loyalty to a single boss whose authority came from Sicilian lineage rather than capability. Disputes were settled through vendettas, not negotiation. Alliances were rigid, ethnicity-based, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Every crime family operated like a feudal kingdom, with little incentive to cooperate. Money was left on the table because bosses were too busy settling personal scores to focus on profit. For Luciano, who had survived betrayal, poverty, and near death, this wasn't just inefficient. It was suicidal. He made a decision that would shock even his closest allies. The old mafia families had to be restructured from top to bottom. That meant eliminating bosses who refused to modernize. It meant rewriting rules that had existed for centuries. And it meant creating something the underworld had never seen before: a centralized system of authority that connected every major criminal operation across New York, and eventually across the United States. The first building block of Luciano's new order was the 5 families. Instead of one all-powerful boss of bosses, he divided New York's mafia into 5 separate, autonomous families, each powerful, each respected, and each bound by a shared set of rules. This decentralization was radical. It ensured that no single man could monopolize control, reducing the temptation for violent coups. It created balance. It created predictability. And it created long-term stability, something the mafia had never experienced before. But the 5 families alone weren't enough. Luciano knew that if these powerful groups operated independently without oversight, chaos would return. So he introduced his masterstroke, the Commission, a governing body of crime bosses, Italian, Jewish, and occasionally Irish, who would come together to regulate the underworld like a corporate board. It was a groundbreaking idea. Instead of killing each other to solve disagreements, bosses would negotiate. Instead of assassinations triggered by ego, decisions would be made by majority vote. The Commission transformed crime from an emotional enterprise into a rational one. This was the essence of Luciano's genius. He brought structure to chaos. He replaced unpredictable violence with predictable processes. He turned criminal activity into a business model. And he introduced checks and balances in a world that had always operated on raw dominance. Behind every organizational decision, there was a psychological brilliance. Luciano understood something fundamental about human behavior. People fight when they feel insecure, but they cooperate when they feel protected. To maintain loyalty, he needed to make his allies feel safe, not just physically but economically. So he distributed rackets evenly, ensuring every family had stable revenue streams. He formalized partnerships across ethnic lines. He strategically placed men he trusted in key positions, not because of their bloodline but because of their competence. He treated criminal enterprises the same way Wall Street tycoons treated corporations, with an eye for management, oversight, and growth. Money was the engine. Violence was the last resort. Diplomacy was the tool that kept the engine running. Luciano also understood that the mafia needed insulation from law enforcement. Under the old system, bosses flaunted their power openly, inviting police attention. Luciano banned this behavior. He insisted on low profiles, legitimate front businesses, and subtle influence rather than loud intimidation. Corruption became more calculated. Instead of bribing dozens of low-level cops, he focused on key officials who could deliver results quietly and efficiently. It was less risky, more stable, and far more effective. The greatest leap forward, however, was his decision to collaborate across ethnic boundaries. Working closely with Meyer Lansky and other Jewish mobsters wasn't just unconventional, it was revolutionary. Lansky had a financial mind that complemented Luciano's organizational intelligence. Together, they created national syndicates in gambling, narcotics, transportation, and labor unions. They invested profits into legitimate businesses, used them as fronts, and laundered money at a scale previously unimaginable. What Luciano built wasn't merely a criminal empire, it was an entire economic system. Rackets were treated as industries. Territories were treated as markets. Criminals were treated as employees. And the commission functioned like a corporate regulatory body, ensuring that every major decision was examined, debated, and approved. In time, this structure became so efficient that it regulated crime across the country. Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Miami. Everywhere the mafia existed, Luciano's model guided it. The commission effectively became the invisible government of the American underworld, and Luciano was the architect. This transformation wasn't just about business. It reflected the psychological evolution he had undergone. The scars on his face, the betrayals he endured, the chaos he witnessed, all of it taught him that raw strength couldn't build a lasting empire. Intelligence could. Adaptation could. Strategy could. The new mafia spoke his language, calculated, organized, united. He didn't see himself as a king. He saw himself as a designer, a builder, a man reshaping the future. His system was meant to survive long after he was gone. It was the culmination of every lesson he'd learned, from the streets, from his alliances, from his enemies, and from the near-death experience that forced him to reimagine everything about power. Organized crime too. Zero wasn't just the next chapter of the mafia, it was Luciano's greatest legacy. A blueprint for criminal enterprise that would influence generations of mobsters and reshape the entire underworld. And it all began with one radical idea, that even in a world built on crime, organization could be the most powerful weapon of all. Inside Luciano's new order, power was no longer forced, it was engineered. But even the most sophisticated criminal empire relied on something far more delicate than guns or money, the psychology of control. And for Luciano, this meant mastering the invisible forces that governed human behavior: loyalty, fear, ambition, pride, secrecy. He understood that men were not controlled by rules alone, they were controlled by the emotions tied to those rules. The Code of Omerta, the mafia's ancient vow of silence, was not simply a tradition to him. It was a psychological weapon, a means of shaping identity, loyalty, and obedience on a level deeper than fear could ever reach. To survive in this world, every man needed to believe two things: that breaking the code would destroy him, that keeping the code made him part of something bigger than himself. Luciano mastered both sides of this equation. In his hands, Omerta wasn't just about secrecy, it was about emotional architecture, building a structure where every man felt connected, committed, and controlled. He understood that loyalty was never absolute. Men were loyal when loyalty benefited them. So instead of demanding blind devotion, Luciano created a system where loyalty felt natural. He made sure his associates profited. He protected them. He rewarded competence, punished betrayal with precision, and ensured his men felt secure as long as they followed the rules. By doing this, he turned Omerta from a rigid code into a shared understanding. Breaking silence wasn't just an offense, it was a betrayal of the collective identity he had built. Fear, however, was still part of the equation. Luciano believed in balance. He knew that men respected a boss they benefited from, but they obeyed a boss they feared. Yet he never used fear recklessly. He never screamed, bragged, or made threats just to show dominance. Instead, he made fear quiet, subtle, almost invisible. His punishments were carefully calculated, delivered only when necessary, and often executed with such precision that no one questioned the consequences. Violence from Luciano was not emotional, it was strategic. Each act sent a message without creating unnecessary enemies. This psychological mixture, fear wrapped in respect, became the backbone of his control. Men followed him not because he forced them to, but because he made them believe that following him was the smartest path to survival and success. Luciano also understood that power wasn't only about leading, it was about reading people. He had a rare ability to assess a man's strengths and weaknesses within minutes. He knew who could be trusted, who needed reassurance, who needed intimidation, who responded to money, and who responded to pride. This allowed him to build teams with perfect emotional chemistry. He paired calm thinkers with aggressive fighters. He placed smooth talkers in negotiation roles. He positioned silent killers where silence mattered most. Every man's nature was used to the advantage of the organization. The commission structure relied heavily on his psychological insight. He ensured rival bosses felt included so they wouldn't feel threatened. He gave them just enough power to satisfy their egos, but not enough to destabilize the system. He allowed them to believe they were independent leaders, even though the system itself ensured their decisions aligned with the collective. This was psychological manipulation on a grand scale, not through force but through design. Luciano also recognized the emotional weight of tradition. To the older Sicilian bosses, omerta wasn't just a rule, it was their identity. They saw it as the sacred heart of their culture. Rather than dismiss this, Luciano embraced it publicly, even as he redefined its meaning privately. He used their respect for tradition to earn their trust while subtly shifting their world toward modernity. This ability to honor the old while building the new made him uniquely effective in unifying generations of gangsters under one structure. One of the most profound psychological tactics he employed was control through calmness. Luciano rarely lost his temper. He didn't need to. His composure intimidated people more than anger ever could. While others shouted to appear powerful, Luciano spoke softly and directly. His calmness made men nervous. They couldn't predict him, couldn't read him, couldn't tell whether he was pleased or disappointed. And in the underworld, unpredictability controlled people far more effectively than brute force. Omerta also gave Luciano something else: insulation. A man who lived by silence couldn't betray you, and a man who broke silence signed his own death warrant. This created a culture of self-policing. Luciano didn't need to watch every man individually because the code watched them for him. The identity he helped forge, loyal soldier, silent brother, respected member, kept his men aligned even when he wasn't in the room. But beneath the layers of loyalty and tradition, Luciano's psychological dominance was rooted in one truth: he made himself indispensable. Everyone relied on him: rivals, partners, killers, negotiators. They needed his intelligence, his fairness, his ability to prevent unnecessary wars. When men depend on you for survival, loyalty becomes instinct, not obligation. His power didn't come from being feared, it came from being respected. It came from the belief that without him, everything would collapse into chaos again. He made himself the center of gravity in a world spinning with danger. And in a universe where betrayal was always one conversation away, his mastery of human psychology was the force that kept the mafia organized, profitable, and united. Omerta was the symbol. Fear was the tool. Respect was the strategy. And psychological insight was the glue that held it all together. This was Luciano's true genius, not just in building the modern mafia, but in understanding that controlling men required far more than orders. It required shaping their identities, their fears, their loyalties, and even their ambitions. He didn't merely lead an organization. He engineered the minds that powered it. By the time Luciano re-engineered the mafia into a modern, structured machine, he had already embraced the mindset of a businessman disguised as a criminal. But the transformation wasn't merely political, it was economic. He didn't just control crime, he organized it into industries. He turned chaos into supply chains, turned hustlers into employees, and turned illegal trades into profit engines that fed an entire national network. The brilliance of Luciano's economic mind wasn't that he knew how to make money, it was that he knew how to scale it, stabilize it, and shield it from collapse. He saw the underworld the way industrial magnates saw their corporations, as systems of production, distribution, regulation, and growth. At the heart of Luciano's empire were the rackets, the lifeblood of organized crime. Each racket was a marketplace, each marketplace had a demand, and each demand required structure. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor racketeering, alcohol smuggling, unions, nightclubs, docks, trucking routes, every sector offered a different opportunity, and Luciano treated each one as a piece of a larger economic puzzle. He didn't approach these enterprises like a gangster reacting to circumstances. He approached them like an executive planning a multi-department corporation. Gambling was one of his first major industries. Unlike street-level gambling operations run by amateurs, Luciano saw gambling as a massive financial engine if properly regulated. He eliminated unpredictable operators and replaced them with dependable crews who ran games with consistency, fairness, relative to criminal standards, and efficiency. He built networks of bookmakers, casino operators, and numbers runners. He ensured payouts were reliable because reliability encouraged repeat business. And for every dollar lost at a table or a betting line, Luciano made sure a percentage flowed straight upward to the families and the commission. He treated prostitution the same way, morally detached, strategically focused. To him, the moral debate was irrelevant. Demand existed, so supply had to be controlled. But what he understood better than anyone was that prostitution, if unorganized, created noise, public attention, police raids, inconsistent profits. So he standardized it. Brothels were placed under strict rules. Workers were monitored, profits recorded, and police bribed systematically rather than haphazardly. He turned the oldest profession into a streamlined business that fed constant income into the mafia treasury. Ironically, it was this very system that later led to his downfall, but during his rise, it was one of the most profitable networks in the underworld. Narcotics, however, were a different beast. The profits were astronomical, but so were the risks. Many old-school bosses refused to touch drugs, believing they brought too much heat. Luciano saw the opposite. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. He recognized the scale of the market before most criminals even understood it. International suppliers in Europe, distribution through New York docks, networks of couriers, all of these formed a global web that Luciano mapped with remarkable clarity. He didn't handle drugs himself, but he built the infrastructure, the connections, the routes, the middlemen. His intelligence made him understand something crucial. Narcotics were not a street hustle, they were an international commodity, and he treated them accordingly. Labor racketeering was where Luciano's genius shined brightest. While others pushed union leaders around, Luciano understood the true leverage unions provided. By controlling the men who loaded ships, built buildings, and operated heavy machinery, he controlled the flow of commerce itself. Legitimate industries relied on those workers, and through quiet influence, threats, and strategic bribes, Luciano placed the mafia's hand firmly on the throat of American labor. Strikes could be arranged. Strikes could be broken. Construction companies could be squeezed. Dockyard shipments could be controlled, delayed, or taxed. This wasn't petty extortion. It was economic domination. But what made these industries runaway successes wasn't just the money flowing in, it was the organization behind them. Luciano built distribution networks that mirrored legitimate businesses. Rackets were divided into territories. Territories had managers. Managers had staff. Profits were recorded. Rules were enforced. No one stole from the organization. No one acted independently. Each racket became a department within a larger economic engine, and the commission served as the boardroom overseeing it all. Luciano also understood that diversification protected his empire. If one racket fell under police pressure, others could support the families financially. If one boss lost territory, the commission redistributed opportunities to maintain balance. No single disaster could collapse the entire structure because everything was interconnected. This mirrored the financial philosophy of legitimate corporate tycoons who spread investments across industries to minimize risk. His approach to corruption was equally methodical. Rather than throw money blindly at every cop or judge, Luciano invested in strategic relationships. He bought influence, not obedience. He focused on officials who could provide long-term security, such as district attorneys, union officers, journalists, and politicians. He understood something most criminals didn't. Corruption wasn't about bribery, it was about building partnerships. In return for favors, politicians received votes from union members, campaign donations, and influence over labor. The relationship became mutually beneficial, making it far more stable than ordinary bribery. This economic sophistication allowed Luciano to transform criminality into a system that looked, from the outside, almost legitimate. Nightclubs owned by front men were filled with celebrities. Construction companies connected to the mafia won city contracts. Trucking firms controlled by the families dominated supply chains. Everything was connected and everything fed money upward. The brilliance of Luciano's economic mind wasn't only in making money, it was in maximizing it. He replaced impulsive, chaotic crime with long-term profit strategies. He created predictable income streams. He encouraged alliances over violence, because alliances increased profits while violence disrupted them. He made criminal activity feel organized, almost professional. Every decision was weighed against its financial impact. Every partnership was evaluated for long-term gain. Every racket was analyzed like a business model. This shift in mentality created something the criminal world had never seen before: stability. For the first time in New York's history, the underworld operated like a functioning economy rather than a war zone. And at the center of it all was Lucky Luciano, the strategist who understood that money wasn't just wealth, it was control. Money kept families fed, kept gangsters loyal, kept unions obedient, and kept politicians friendly. Money was the invisible force binding the syndicate together. The business of crime, under Luciano's leadership, became more than profit. It became the foundation of a national network of influence, power, and fear. He turned illegal enterprises into industries and industries into empires. And with each profitable racket, Luciano proved that in the underworld, as in legitimate society, the most powerful man is not the one with the gun, but the one who controls the flow of money. The empire Luciano built did not rise in a vacuum. It grew out of a landscape crowded with hungry, ambitious men, each with their own dreams of power, wealth, and immortality. Some became his greatest allies. Others became his most dangerous enemies. And in the violent, uncertain ecosystem of New York's underworld, every relationship carried a shadow, every alliance had an expiration date, and every handshake concealed a blade. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He knew that power in the mafia wasn't static, it was a living chessboard, where every player was both a partner and a potential threat. Among his closest allies, Meyer Lansky was the one who provided the intellectual symmetry Luciano needed. Lansky wasn't driven by ego or impulsiveness. He was analytical, calculating, and cool. Where Luciano relied on instinct, Lansky relied on numbers. Together they operated like two sides of the same mind. Lansky helped stabilize income flows, remove emotional decision-making, and structure gambling enterprises with mathematical precision. Their friendship was built on an unusual foundation for the criminal world: mutual respect, trust, and an appreciation for each other's brilliance. Lansky didn't want the spotlight. Luciano didn't need to dominate him. Their collaboration became the backbone of the national syndicate. Then there was Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, the lightning to Lansky's calm. Siegel was fearless to a fault, charismatic, and wildly unpredictable. His violent energy made him both an asset and a liability. Luciano used Siegel like a weapon, pointed only when necessary, unleashed only when precision demanded speed and brutality. Siegel's ferocity intimidated rivals and secured territory, but Luciano knew he could never rely on Bugsy for long-term planning. Bugsy was raw force while Luciano was strategy. Yet despite Siegel's chaos, Luciano valued him deeply. He understood that empires are not built by calm thinkers alone. They require warriors, men willing to do what others wouldn't. Bugsy was that man. Frank Costello added another crucial dimension: diplomacy. Costello was the politician of the group, a master of charm who navigated high society, influenced politicians, and secured unions without firing a single shot. He knew how to make deals that kept the families wealthy and kept the police distracted. To Luciano, Costello was indispensable, a bridge to the legitimate world, a man whose tongue was sharper than any knife. Costello didn't command soldiers. He commanded votes, support, and subtle shifts of influence. This made him powerful beyond measure. These three, Lansky, Siegel, and Costello, formed the inner circle that helped Luciano expand beyond the limitations of old-world customs. But outside this circle existed a constellation of rivals whose ambitions intersected dangerously with his own. One of the most volatile enemies Luciano ever faced was Dutch Schultz. Schultz was everything Luciano despised in a criminal: impulsive, ego-driven, unpredictable, and stubbornly resistant to order. Schultz wasn't a businessman, he was a gangster in the purest sense, built on fear, violence, and instinct. He controlled lucrative territories and made enormous profits, but he did so recklessly. Luciano saw potential in Schultz's operations, but he also saw the long-term threat Schultz posed. The problem wasn't Schultz's ambition, it was his lack of restraint. His feud with prosecutor Thomas Dewey threatened to destabilize the entire underworld. Luciano warned Schultz repeatedly to back down, but Schultz's ego wouldn't allow it. When Schultz began plotting to assassinate Dewey, Luciano faced a moral dilemma. If Dewey was killed, the government would unleash a fury that could destroy every family in New York. If Schultz lived, the mafia's future stability was at risk. So Luciano made the coldest, most strategic decision of his early reign. Schultz had to die. Not because of personal animosity, but to protect the system he was building. The hit was authorized by the commission, and Schultz's violent career ended in a hail of bullets. It was a clear message. No one, not even successful gangsters, could jeopardize the syndicate's future. Another adversary Luciano needed to navigate was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano represented the old world mentality, the rigid, Sicilian-dominated hierarchy that viewed men like Luciano, who embraced multi-ethnic partnerships, as traitors to tradition. Maranzano emerged from the Castellamarese War believing himself to be the supreme ruler of the American Mafia. He crowned himself boss of bosses, a title Luciano rejected as outdated and dangerous. Their alliance was uneasy from the start. Maranzano respected Luciano's intelligence but distrusted his progressive ideas. Luciano respected Maranzano's power but despised his rigidity. The tension between them escalated quickly. Maranzano began quietly ordering the assassinations of young leaders he perceived as threats, Luciano included. Luciano responded with the strategic ruthlessness that defined his rule. He authorized an unprecedented move. Maranzano was assassinated not by Italian soldiers, but by Jewish hitmen disguised as government agents. This broke every old mafia rule, but it saved the future. With Maranzano gone, the last obstacle to modernization was removed. Beyond these major rivals, the underworld teemed with ambitious lieutenants, jealous bosses, and dangerous operators who had their own agendas. Men like Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Tony Bender navigated loyalties carefully, knowing Luciano had the power to elevate them, or eliminate them. Luciano balanced them with precision. He gave them responsibilities, rewarded their successes, and monitored their ambitions closely. He understood that the men who stood closest to him were the ones most likely to stab him in the back if given the chance. This constant tension, alliances built on shifting sands, kept Luciano alert. His brilliance lay in his ability to read people not as they appeared, but as they truly were. He noticed jealous glances, hesitations, changes in tone. He sensed when loyalty weakened. He understood greed, pride, and fear at levels beyond ordinary perception. This allowed him to maintain control without appearing tyrannical. He played his allies like chess pieces. Lansky as the strategist, Siegel as the enforcer, Costello as the diplomat. He neutralized enemies through negotiation, manipulation, or, when necessary, violence. And he maintained a balance of power so carefully structured that no family could dominate another. This equilibrium didn't eliminate conflict, it managed it. Luciano didn't believe conflict could ever fully disappear from the underworld. But he believed it could be controlled, channeled, and contained. His ability to navigate allies and enemies with equal skill transformed the mafia from a fractured battlefield into a regulated society. In the world he built, alliances were not friendships, they were mutual survivals. And enemies were not obstacles, they were tests, each one sharpening Luciano's strategic instincts. Every handshake contained a calculation. Every alliance was a negotiation. Every rival was a potential tool or a potential threat. This was the chessboard of power that defined Luciano's reign, a world where betrayal was always possible, where loyalty shifted like tides, and where the most dangerous weapon was not a gun, but a mind capable of seeing 5 moves ahead. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had achieved something unprecedented. He unified the underworld, stabilized the rackets, and built a criminal system that flowed like a well-oiled machine. But with success came new pressures. Internal rivalries, government scrutiny, jealous underbosses, and shifting street dynamics that could erupt into chaos at any moment. While Luciano had designed his empire to prevent the bloody wars that plagued the past, no organization, legal or illegal, could escape the natural force of conflict. Beneath the calm surface of the Commission's order, a hidden war was brewing, shaped not by open gunfire but by politics, paranoia, and the relentless advance of law enforcement. At the center of the external pressure was a young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey wasn't just another lawman looking to make arrests. He was a political crusader determined to become a national hero by dismantling organized crime. He studied gangsters the way Luciano studied markets, methodically, obsessively, with a clear long-term strategy. Dewey climbed the political ladder by positioning himself as the man who would clean New York of corruption, and Luciano's empire was his ultimate target. He saw Luciano not as a man but as a symbol, a dark force controlling vice, unions, gambling, prostitution, and narcotics. Taking down Luciano would make Dewey a household name. For Luciano, Dewey represented a new kind of enemy. Most rivals were impulsive, emotional, or blinded by greed. Dewey was none of that. He was disciplined, intelligent, and incorruptible, immune to bribery, intimidation, or negotiation. Luciano could read gangsters perfectly, but politicians like Dewey operated on a different logic. Dewey wanted order, justice, and public praise. Luciano wanted stability, profit, and control. Their clash was inevitable. The hidden war also brewed within the mafia itself. The organization Luciano built was brilliant, but brilliance does not eliminate ambition. Underbosses like Vito Genovese watched Luciano's rise with a mixture of admiration and envy. Genovese craved power. He believed he deserved more authority than Luciano allowed him. While Luciano promoted cooperation and long-term planning, Genovese preferred aggressive expansion. This ideological conflict simmered between them quietly, unspoken but undeniable. Other factions had their own frustrations. Some old-school bosses still resented Luciano's alliance with Jewish mobsters. Others felt they were not receiving their fair share of profits. Younger gangsters admired Luciano's modern approach, but they also hungered for status. And in the shadows of these tensions, police pressure intensified. When criminals felt cornered, they often made reckless moves. Luciano knew that one wrong action by a single crew could bring government scrutiny crashing down on the entire syndicate. And then there was the explosion of violence that followed Dutch Schultz's assassination. While Luciano and the commission believed the hit was necessary, Schultz's empire didn't vanish quietly. His remaining associates scattered across the city, some seeking allegiance with other families, others plotting revenge or carving out rogue territory. This sudden power vacuum created dangerous instability. Luciano found himself playing mediator, negotiator, and strategist simultaneously, trying to contain outbreaks of violence before they attracted government attention. Labor racketeering brought its own complications. Controlling unions was lucrative, but the more influence the mafia gained, the more attention it drew from federal investigators. Strikes were manipulated to benefit the families. Companies were extorted. But each move carried risk. Every dock loaded under mafia supervision, every contract guided by Costello's political influence, every union leader brought into the fold added another layer to the hidden war between legitimacy and criminality. Luciano understood this delicate balance more than anyone, but even he could feel the tension rising like steam beneath a pressure valve. Meanwhile, Dewey intensified his campaign. He pursued bookies, pimps, madams, and union officials with tireless determination. One by one, he dismantled smaller networks, hoping they would lead him to the core of the empire. He raided brothels, pressured informants, and used the media to fuel public outrage. His speeches painted the underworld as an invisible government that needed to be destroyed. Luciano had built his empire in the shadows, but Dewey wanted to drag it into the spotlight. And with enough public pressure, even corrupt officials found it risky to protect the mafia. On the streets, paranoia grew. Gangsters whispered about surveillance, about undercover cops, about Dewey's expanding movement. Some feared the prosecutor more than rival families. Others began making mistakes, rushing operations, fleeing town, hiding profits, or reacting emotionally to pressure. Luciano tried to calm them, reminding them that panic created more danger than police ever could. But even he knew the truth: the city was changing. Law enforcement was evolving. And the mafia could not hide forever behind bribes and intimidation. Inside the commission meetings, tensions occasionally cracked through the calm. Bosses argued about strategy. Some wanted to lie low, shut down rackets temporarily, and avoid attracting Dewey's attention. Others insisted on pushing forward, believing retreat would make them appear weak. Luciano sat at the center of these debates, absorbing each opinion, analyzing each move, and balancing the volatile egos around him. He made decisions not just for the present moment, but for the long-term survival of the syndicate. The hidden war was not fought with bullets alone. It was fought with strategy, psychology, and political maneuvering. Luciano had to outthink both internal threats and external forces. He kept his allies close, watched his rivals with quiet caution, and studied Dewey's moves like a chess player anticipating an opponent's next turn. Every arrest, every headline, every rumor mattered. The hidden war tested Luciano's intelligence more than any street conflict ever had. And through it all, he sensed something: the world around him was shifting. Law enforcement was becoming more organized. Prosecutors were becoming more aggressive. Journalists were becoming more influential. The public had grown tired of corruption. The underworld that once thrived in the shadows was now being dragged unwillingly into the light. Luciano could feel the pressure closing in, but he maintained his composure. He had built an empire by understanding human behavior, and he believed he could navigate this storm as well. But even the sharpest mind cannot foresee every attack. The hidden war was only the beginning. Dewey's crusade was about to strike at the heart of the empire. And Luciano, the man who had survived poverty, gang wars, betrayal, and near death, was about to face the most dangerous enemy of all. The American justice system, armed with ambition, public support, and a determination to destroy him. The storm was gathering. The prosecutor was closing in. And the empire Luciano built was about to enter its most critical test. One that would change the trajectory of his life forever. When the moment finally came, when the courtroom doors closed behind him and the sentence was handed down, lucky Luciano felt the weight of the empire he had built shift onto unfamiliar ground. For the first time since his rise, he was no longer free to negotiate, maneuver, or walk the streets he controlled. Instead, he was taken in chains to Dannemora, the harsh, icy fortress known as Little Siberia, one of the toughest prisons in America. To many, this was the end of his reign. The newspapers called it a victory for justice. Dewey claimed a historic triumph, and politicians celebrated the fall of the nation's most influential gangster. But inside those cold stone walls, Luciano was far from powerless. Prison didn't destroy his influence. It refined it, concentrated it, transformed it into something even more dangerous. The moment he entered Dannemora, Luciano realized that survival would demand adaptation. Prison was a world with its own hierarchy, codes, and tensions. But compared to the underworld he came from, this system was predictable, and predictability was something Luciano could weaponize. He observed the routines, studied the guards, watched the alliances among inmates, and paid attention to who commanded respect. In a place where most men acted out of fear or desperation, Luciano behaved with a calmness that unsettled everyone. He didn't panic, didn't lash out, didn't show weakness. He carried himself with the same quiet authority he had on the streets. And within weeks, even hardened criminals recognized something different in him. This man wasn't intimidated. He was evaluating. Luciano quickly noticed that prison politics mirrored the outside world. There were leaders, power brokers, informants, and corrupt officials. Some prisoners controlled contraband. Others ran gambling rings or enforced order in the yard. Luciano didn't try to dominate immediately. He understood that real power came from patience. Instead, he made strategic alliances. He befriended men who controlled cigarettes and food distribution. He befriended older inmates respected by the prison population. He even befriended guards, not with bribes at first but with conversation, insights, and the charisma that had always set him apart. To many guards, Luciano wasn't a monster. He was a fascinating mind, a man who understood systems better than anyone. They appreciated his respectful demeanor and lack of troublemaking. And little by little, Luciano cultivated the same relationships inside prison that he once cultivated in the underworld. These weren't bribes, not initially. They were seeds. And in the unforgiving environment of Dannemora, seeds grew fast. Soon, Luciano began influencing daily life. He resolved disputes between inmates. He advised guards on how to handle problem prisoners. He helped maintain order in the yard. His ability to predict conflict, understand emotional triggers, and mediate rivalries made him invaluable. He became a stabilizing force, not because he wanted to help the prison but because stability created opportunity. The more the institution trusted him, the more freedom he gained. And the more freedom he gained, the more access he had to the outside world. Word began to spread beyond prison walls that Luciano was still in control, maybe even more than before. His lieutenants in New York continued running the rackets. The commission still respected his authority. Costello managed political relationships. Lansky handled finances. And the families continued to function under the system Luciano had designed. Prison, paradoxically, made him appear untouchable. He wasn't dodging assassins or managing daily operations, but his influence remained deep and unchallenged. He had become a symbol of order, a patriarchal figure whose ideas shaped the entire underworld. But his power behind bars wasn't limited to quiet influence. As World War II erupted, a surprising opportunity arose that no one could have predicted. In 1942, the U.S. government faced a crisis. German submarines were sinking supply ships off the American coast, and rumors circulated that Nazi agents were operating through East Coast docks. The Navy needed help securing the ports, help that government officials suspected could only come from one place: organized crime. Through intermediaries, officials reached out to Luciano. They wanted cooperation. They wanted intelligence. They wanted peace on the docks. Luciano, still controlling the waterfront unions through his associates, agreed to assist. He provided information, facilitated meetings, and used his influence to ensure dockworkers cooperated with federal security measures. The Navy believed that his involvement reduced sabotage threats. Some historians argue the Mafia's role has been exaggerated, but the government believed enough to grant him unprecedented leverage. This cooperation became the turning point of Luciano's prison experience. It proved he was still a man whose influence extended far beyond prison walls. It proved the empire he built was resilient, capable of functioning even while its creator was locked away. And it proved something even more important. The U.S. government, the same institution that imprisoned him, found him useful. As a result, whispers of clemency began to circulate. Governors, prosecutors, and politicians debated whether Luciano's assistance merited a reduction in his sentence. Dewey himself, once Luciano's greatest adversary, eventually acknowledged his wartime cooperation. And although Dewey did not reverse his stance on Luciano's guilt, he publicly confirmed that Luciano had provided meaningful help. But even as Luciano's political options grew, he remained psychologically tethered to the empire outside. He received messages through lawyers, coded letters, and trusted visitors. He advised on disputes. He approved major decisions. His lieutenants consulted him like a council of elders might consult a retired king. Prison gave him time to reflect, but reflection never interrupted control. His mind remained a chessboard, always planning several moves ahead. Life in Dannemora changed him, but not in the way most expected. He didn't become softer. He didn't break. Instead, prison stripped away the distractions of daily criminal management and left him alone with his own thoughts, his own strategies, and his own ambitions. He became more contemplative, more philosophical, and more aware of the limits of power. Prison, in its strange way, made him more focused, and perhaps more dangerous. But it also brought a quiet understanding. Nothing he built could stay under his command forever. Younger men were rising. New threats were emerging. Times were changing. And while he could still influence the empire from behind bars, he knew he couldn't control it indefinitely. Something inside him began to shift, a recognition that the mafia he created was evolving beyond his grasp. Yet even with this realization, his dominance remained unquestioned. Guards respected him. Inmates deferred to him. Politicians considered his value. The commission operated with his blueprint. Luciano had become what he always aimed to be, indispensable. In the end, power behind bars was not simply about maintaining authority. It was about proving that true influence, real, lasting influence, is not confined by walls or bars. It lives in the systems a man builds, the minds he shapes, and the loyalties he cultivates. Luciano entered prison as a fallen king. He ruled it as a silent emperor. When the gates of Dannemora finally opened for him in 1946, it was not freedom that greeted lucky Luciano, but exile. His sentence hadn't been overturned. It had been bargained. In exchange for wartime cooperation and political pressure from influential figures, he was granted clemency on a single condition. He would be deported to Italy and never return to the United States. After decades of climbing from street kid to criminal architect, Luciano was forced to leave the empire he had built behind. America, the country that shaped him, empowered him, and ultimately condemned him, spat him out. For a man who had once ruled the underworld from coast to coast, exile wasn't just a punishment. It was a psychological wound. He arrived in Naples to crowds of curious onlookers, reporters, and law enforcement ready to strip him of any remaining illusions of control. The country he returned to was nothing like the Sicily of his childhood. Italy had been gutted by war, burned by fascism, and left in ruins. In those first days, Luciano walked streets filled with poverty, rubble, and political uncertainty, and he felt something he had rarely experienced before: detachment. He no longer belonged anywhere, not in America and not in Italy. But exile didn't erase influence. Even in a foreign land, Luciano's name carried weight. Gangsters visited him, political figures monitored him, and intelligence agencies shadowed him. His very presence worried governments. America feared that he would rebuild the narcotics trade from abroad. Italy feared he would unify the southern criminal clans. The press portrayed him as a shadowy mastermind scheming to re-enter the American underworld from across the ocean. But for the first time in his life, Luciano was operating without a base, without infrastructure, and without the constant stream of reports that once fed his strategic mind. Still he tried. It wasn't in his nature to simply fade away. From hotels, cafes, and seaside apartments, Luciano held meetings with figures from Sicily, Naples, and Rome. Old friends, new operators, ambitious upstarts. They came to him not just out of loyalty but out of curiosity. What would the great Lucky Luciano do now? He observed the Italian underworld and was struck by how fragmented it still was. The Mafia in Sicily, the Camorra in Naples, the emerging 'Ndrangheta in Calabria. Each operated with its own traditions, grudges, and internal struggles. Italy's criminal factions reminded Luciano of New York before he reorganized it. And despite being a stranger in his own homeland, the strategist in him began to imagine what could be built if these groups cooperated. But Italy was not America. The police followed his every move. Government officials pressured landlords to deny him housing. U.S. agents stationed in Europe monitored him relentlessly, terrified he might re-establish the global narcotics pipeline. Every phone call was tracked. Every visitor documented. Luciano quickly realized that building another empire in Italy would require more risk and bring more heat than any reward could justify. His mind, once a machine of expansion, now bent toward survival. Still, the myth of his involvement in international narcotics smuggling persisted. Whether he orchestrated the drug trade or whether the underworld simply used his name as leverage remains a matter of historical debate. But what mattered to Luciano wasn't the truth, it was the perception. The world believed he was pulling strings, and in a way that belief kept him powerful even when his actual control was far more limited. As the years passed, Luciano settled into a routine that blended loneliness with ritual. Mornings were spent reading newspapers from America, tracking the evolution of the mafia he founded. Afternoons brought visitors, some seeking advice, others simply seeking the legend. Evenings were quiet, filled with reflection, memories, and the unspoken ache of exile. He had lived his entire life surrounded by people, yet now he felt profoundly alone. The commission carried on without him. Genovese, Costello, Gambino, Anastasia, men he once guided or restrained, were shaping the new underworld in ways he could no longer influence directly. But he watched closely, analyzing each new shift in power. When Genovese clawed his way to control. When Albert Anastasia was assassinated. When Costello's political era waned. When the mafia expanded to Las Vegas. Luciano saw all of it from afar. Sometimes he approved of their moves. Sometimes he shook his head in disappointment. But always he understood, the organization had grown beyond him. That realization weighed heavily. The empire he built no longer needed its architect. These years forced Luciano into a type of introspection he never allowed himself during his reign. In America he had been too busy calculating, commanding, and surviving to think deeply about morality or personal cost. Exile changed that. Stripped of power, he began revisiting moments from the past, not the glamorous ones but the brutal ones. He thought about the men he eliminated, the trust he manipulated, the wars he helped spark. He thought about the people who followed him with loyalty, and the enemies who died trying to defeat him. He wondered whether the system he built had stabilized the underworld or simply made it more efficient at destroying lives. This psychological evolution didn't soften him, but it made him clearer, more honest with himself. He accepted that power was always temporary, that influence faded, and that every empire, licit or illicit, was destined to change hands. Yet despite these reflections he never regretted building the modern mafia. In his mind he had brought order to chaos. He had imposed structure where others brought destruction. He had made criminals behave like businessmen instead of butchers. If the underworld was destined to exist, he believed he made it better, smarter, and more controlled. Toward the end of his life, circumstances brought him to Havana, where he attempted to reconnect with the American syndicate leaders during a brief period when Cuban corruption gave him breathing room. The Havana Conference of 1946 was his last great moment, a gathering of mafia leaders from across the country, all paying homage to the man who had built the foundation they stood on. For a brief moment, Luciano felt the warmth of relevance again. Decisions flowed through him. Plans were debated. Respect was palpable. But it didn't last. Under pressure from the United States, the Cuban government arrested him and deported him back to Italy. The final flicker of his direct connection to the American Mafia was extinguished. In his later years, Luciano spent more time reflecting than strategizing. He walked the Neapolitan waterfront quietly, observing families, fishermen, and tourists who had no idea who he was. He drank espresso at small cafes. He told stories to a handful of trusted friends. He watched the world modernize around him as his own era faded into myth. The endgame of his life was not marked by violence or dramatic betrayal. Instead, it was marked by contemplation, a slow recognition that his true empire was not the criminal network he built, but the system he designed. That system would outlive him, grow beyond him, and influence global organized crime for generations. Whether that legacy was triumph or tragedy, he left for history to decide. In exile, stripped of territory and armies, Luciano discovered the one thing he had never possessed during his reign: time to think. And in those quiet, reflective years, he came to understand the full scope of what he had created, and the price he had paid to create it. In his final years, Lucky Luciano became a distant observer of the empire he once commanded. Exiled in Italy, he watched the American Mafia expand into Las Vegas, Cuba, and beyond, operating on the blueprint he created but evolving far beyond his control. Pride mixed with frustration as he read newspapers detailing power shifts, betrayals, and the fading discipline he once enforced. He often murmured that the new generation didn't understand balance: too much violence, too little strategy. Yet visitors from the criminal world still sought his advice, and his insights remained sharp. Alone with his thoughts, he reflected on the cost of power: the lives taken, the loyalty earned, the fear he inspired, and the chaos he controlled. He didn't claim innocence, nor did he express regret. Instead, he recognized that the empire's survival proved his lasting influence. Even in exile, he remained the mind behind the modern mafia. Lucky Luciano's legacy endures because he didn't just lead the mafia, he redesigned it. Before him, organized crime was chaotic. After him, it became structured, profitable, and national. The 5 families in the commission, born from his vision, outlived him and shaped decades of American crime. He proved that intelligence, not brutality, was the true engine of dominance. But his legacy carried shadows. The system he built enabled future violence, corruption, and international drug networks. History views him through conflicting lenses: strategic genius, criminal architect; necessary evil, cultural icon. Movies and literature turned him into the blueprint for the charismatic Don. In exile, he realized power always shifts and no empire remains perfect. Yet the world he shaped continued without him, proving the strength of his design. Luciano's story endures because it asks a timeless question: can brilliance and brutality ever be separated? His legacy suggests the two are forever entwined.